Okay, so welcome everyone and good evening. My name is Sonia Prescott, and it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to another PHS Live. Our guest today is the Reverend Jimmie Hawkins, who serves as the director of the Presbyterian Church Office of Public Witness in Washington, D.C. We are here to talk about his new book, Unbroken and Unbowed, A History of Black Protests in America. Before we start, I'll just say, as usual, I'm going to do a little introduction. Then there'll be some questions. And then I'm going to open the floor up to the digital floor, to any questions from our audience. Feel free to add those questions into Zoom or Facebook Live into the chat box. Okay. So now I will introduce our guest for the evening. The Reverend Jimmie Hawkins served as the pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Durham, North Carolina from 1996 to 2016. Between 1992 and 1996, he served as the senior pastor of Grace Presbyterian Church, Holmes Memorial Presbyterian Church, and Trinity Presbyterian Churches. He has been active in justice advocacy throughout his ministry and has participated in multiple actions of civil disobedience and direct action. He is married to Shanita Hampton Hawkins, and they have two children, Kayla Renee and James Hampton. Thank you for joining us tonight, Reverend Hawkins.
Thanks for having me.
After reading your bio, it seems evident to me that you are living and have lived a life that uniquely prepared you to write a book such as Unbroken and Unbowed. And I guess my first question for the evening was, what were some reasons that led you to write this book? Did you feel a sense of urgency to address the current political climate?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Obviously, being a person of faith, my primary motivation was God, and give God thanks for that. And, it was during the time of Colin Kaepernick and his protest while he was actively playing. And a lot of the criticism that was targeted at him deemed his actions unpatriotic. And they said, well, what he's doing is an insult to the flag, and he's kneeling during the national anthem. And he explained that, no, that's not true. He says, as a matter of fact, he chose to kneel because he was doing it a symbolic effort to repeat the stance of a soldier who had lost a soldier. And so he was saying that actually out of patriotism, he was doing this, but the criticism, it was so severe and so unrelenting. And even to the point where some sportscasters were saying that fans were boycotting games that he played in. And so that was the primary motivation. At first, I was going to write an article. And you know how things go when you start writing, all of a sudden the bug gets you and just keep writing and keep writing. But there also was another issue that I was trying to address as the book developed. One was that the image of African-American history is oftentimes placed in a box that's either labeled slavery or Jim Crow. There's very little information on the Black experience in the United States of America. And so as I wrote, I really wanted to expand upon that, how Blacks have not been passive victims in this country, but have been very active in the history of the United States. And even in the midst of severe oppression, legalized oppression, there was always pushback, always resistance, always protest. And so that was a motivation for me as well as I wrote the book, because again, every time people talk about Black history, it's always again within the context of Jim Crow or slavery, but Black people have been very active in almost every arena: politicians, entrepreneurs, physicians and nurses, even when it was against the law for them to serve in those areas. And even slaves had a passion for learning to read and write, and many slaves could read and write, but that part of the history is suppressed. And then finally, to talk about, I think one of the undercurrents was to talk about Black identity. How do Black people see themselves, and how has Black identity, I think more so than any other racial ethnic group, it really has evolved over the years, and not just the identities that were projected upon Black people, but the identities that they adopted themselves. And so there are 5 different categories as you go through the book. As a matter of fact, each section is written under the title of that identity. The first section deals with African protests. We know that the first enslaved people in this country long-term were Africans. And so they came in with a certain consciousness and self-awareness because many of them were free. And so they came in with a whole different attitude. So I talk about how having an African identity shaped Black protests. And then as slavery was over, and then Black people adopted the identity of color. And today it's considered a little offensive, but it actually was a banner of pride. In the book, a politician, African-American politician says, we are not white Americans, we're not red Americans, we are colored Americans. And it was a sense of distinction for them, that they are people of color. And then, of course, it evolved into Negro during the Civil Rights Movement. King always addresses his people as Negroes. And that was a term that they, even though some say it was projected onto African Americans, but really African Americans adopted that identity. Say, well, we're no longer African, we're no longer colored, but we are Negro people, which we know in Spanish and Portuguese means Black. And then another evolution was to Black. And they really, I think that was an effort to say, we're Negro is actually no longer how we want to be termed, but we are inclusive, almost a Pan-Africanism sense of consciousness where, yes, for African Americans born in this country, but also all Black people who are part of this struggle. And then, and also a little bit of that, especially for Malcolm X, was the title Afro-American, but it really never caught on wholesale. And what's interesting about Afro-American, that it was also appearing during the colored identity phase. And then lastly, of course, I think many of us refer to ourselves as African Americans today. You see literature and articles using that title. But what's interesting right now is that it's actually, especially for younger people of color, almost a transition back to Black, because Black really never lost relevance. And I think many young adults want to refer to themselves as Black because it is more inclusive than African Americans. But right now, I think African American is the dominant since the 1980s. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have to say that I thought that was one of the most fascinating parts of your work, was just kind of seeing how the different names that were used and how that evolved over time, and kind of the logic behind when a certain identity was used and when it kind of passed away. So I thought that was a really really interesting part of the book. Go back to the next question I have here. So on page 123, you write, after the war to end slavery, the Christian church was no longer the invisible institution hindered by paternalist and domineering oversight. The Church of the African diaspora was a vibrant, living institution. It was the first Black institution under their control that was applied as an instrument of protest and worship. So what role do you see Black Presbyterian churches playing in Black protest movements, kind of back then in 1865 versus now in 2020? What do you feel has kind of changed, and what do you feel has remained the same?
Okay, yeah, the Black church, it cannot be overstated, the contribution of the Black church throughout American history, is contribution to Black protest. I mean, it went hand in hand. As a matter of fact, even during the invisible institution, when the slaves didn't have physical buildings and they had to worship outside in the woods, a theology of liberation developed long before James Cone. And it's amazing to hear clergy talk about the reception or rejection of enslaved Africans, enslaved Black people in this country, of a preaching that taught submission. They rejected it and as a matter of fact, you read stories about Black preachers who knew scripture, even those who could not read, and they, especially once they learned the story of Exodus, they learned that, there's more in the Bible than slaves be submissive to their masters. And they started really, they made it their own. And so Black theology has a long history in this country, again, long before the 1970s and 60s, when it really started becoming popular. And so the Presbyterian Church, I have to pause before I talk about the role the Presbyterian Church played in Black protests, because it's always been careful, always been careful. During the antebellum period, during enslavement, the church was very influenced by Southern Presbyterians who did not want the church to talk about slavery. And we have to remember that during slavery, Southerners were some of the richest people in this country, especially plantation owners. There were plantations that spanned states. And it's amazing the wealth that slavery produced for this country, and especially in the South. So the Presbyterian Church was very careful, but it did make one primary contribution. And again, I have to say that carefully, because there were white clergy who were very engaged in the abolitionist movement. Some lost their lives for the abolitionist movement, who were Presbyterians. But by and large, there was not a wholesale support of abolitionism by the Presbyterian Church. But education, it really made a substantial impact when it started educating Black people. And so Black Presbyterians played a significant role in the abolitionist movement. As a matter of fact, I am always amazed that when I read a history book, such as Benjamin Correll's book, Black Abolitionists, many of the leaders were African-American Presbyterian clergy. And he makes no reference to the fact that they were Presbyterian or AME, but the church it was a gift to the church. Henry Highland Garnet, just a leader in the abolitionist movement. As a matter of fact, Garnet, he fascinates me because he thought that Frederick Douglass was soft. He thought Frederick Douglass held his tongue back, and they really had a rivalry that went on between the two of them. And Garnet really was a lion, like Douglass. And so you see that J.W.C. Pennington, the fugitive blacksmith, you see individuals like Samuel Cornish, who with his partner started the first Black newspaper in this country. And so Black Presbyterians who were educated had resources that other Black leaders did not have. And so they utilized those resources when they founded churches, from First African of Philadelphia. They were all parts of the Underground Railroad. They would harbor fugitive slaves. They were and they pushed the white community to be more progressive, to be more engaged, and to challenge them and say, there's a lot of hypocrisy going on in the church when you talk about the fact that we're all God's children, and yet you either are silent or you support slavery. And not only that, but the Presbyterian Church also, to a large degree, was partners with those who were not Presbyterian. Frederick Douglass, he was AME Zion, I believe, or AME, but I think he was AME because he was at Metropolitan in DC. And Frederick Douglass had a lot of Presbyterians who supported him. Harriet Tubman, as a matter of fact, when she moved up to Upper New York, was part of the life of the white Presbyterian church there. As a matter of fact, she was married in that church. And Sojourner Truth spoke at 15th Street Presbyterian Church on several occasions. And as a matter of fact, a lot of individuals who were not a part of the church were still impacted positively by the church. And so Black Presbyterian churches and African-American Presbyterians have been engaged in the Black protest movement throughout the history of this country. And you look at the Civil Rights movement, and I find it interesting that the church itself struggled with this role in the Civil Rights movement. It was not as hands-off as it was during slavery, and so the church was starting to find its voice, especially with some of the leadership that we had at that time. Talking about individuals like Reverend Dr. Eugene Carson Blake, who was the stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church, Reverend Dr. William Sloan Coffin, who was a part of the Presbyterian Church, and they were very progressive, especially Blake. I mean, he was out there with the Civil Rights Movement, marching, getting arrested, and he pushed the church, which wanted to be more moderate. The church actually was saying, well, we're not going to condemn we're not going to endorse Jim Crow, but we want to kind of let things take their natural flow. Things, progress is being made, but he challenged the church. And I think out of his leadership that African Americans were very engaged in the life of the church. We began during that period, right after, began to elect our first Black moderators, such as James Costin, Thelma Adair. I think the church really began to struggle with what's our role in this country, and what, especially dealing with the issue of being a prophetic voice. And the church adopted the slogan, an unsegregated church in an unsegregated society. And again, Carson Blake really used that as his speaking point. And I will say that the Black church today, I'm concerned about the role of the Black church, not just Black Presbyterians, but the Black church has always been a prophetic voice for justice. And yet there are inroads being made into the African-American faith community prosperity ministry, where many churches, especially some of the mega churches, the larger congregations, were in there. They have given up that prophetic voice to adopt prosperity ministry, saying that health and wealth are the benefits of faith, when I have never read a passage where Jesus said that or endorsed that, And so I think that we're at an interesting time in the life of the Black church, wherein it's almost a time of jeopardy, wherein justice is no longer being preached to the degree that it once was. As a matter of fact, many of the protest movements in this country are being led by young people. And young people almost usurp the role of people of faith, because there is not a protest movement in the history of this country, whether it's a Black protest movement or any other, where people of faith have not been integral to that movement. But I think today that young people are starting to, with and without the church, to raise voices against injustice.
So another question that I had for you was about what role do you see Black women playing in Black protest movements, and how would you like to highlight that involvement?
There would be no Black protest movements throughout the history of this country without Black women. And Black women have faced a situation wherein they have had to make some difficult choices, because they had two obstacles to overcome. One was obviously racism, the fact that they were women of color, that they were women who were of African descent. But the other was gender bias and gender discrimination. And the challenge for Black women has been that they have not always had the opportunity to address gender bias, because they said, well, we'll deal with the issue of race first, because that's something that an obstacle that we all have to overcome. And so they have subjugated a lot of their issues in the past. I think right now with womanist theology and other movements within Black female circles, we're starting to hear strong Black voices of Black women, but it's always been a struggle from the beginning. Any Black protest movement in this country, Black women have played a majority role, and I always go back, I'm fascinated by, even on slave ships, and that's an area of history that does not get a lot of attention, but on slave ships, there were so many mutinies. I mean, over 200 mutinies were in the past. Historians says, well, the slaves were passive, they were stuck on this ship, there's nothing they could do. But actually there were so many that you had to take out insurance in case there was an insurrection and the ship was lost, or the crew was lost, or the captives took over the ship. Black women were brutalized on the slave ship, oftentimes raped on the slave ships. And so the result was that they were not held a lot of times down below. They had freedom on the deck and were not chained up. But how they used that was that they became the source of liberation for the men below. They would oftentimes smuggle weapons to the men. They would be the ones who would give information saying that no one's on guard right now. If you can get out, this is a good time to have a rebellion on the ship. And so we look at the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, every role that Black men played in all of these movements, Black women played as well. And it's ironic that during the civil rights movement, a movement for liberation, to overthrow Jim Crow, to do away with all of the just social discrimination that Blacks face, wherein you had to tip your hat to someone who was white. If you were walking down the sidewalk, you literally had to get off of the sidewalk. Inferior schools and Black inferiority was projected very strongly towards Black people. That Black women were the ones who oftentimes had to be the breadwinners because Black men were given such positions that they could not make enough money to support the family. And Black women were the ones oftentimes who had to almost be the man in the house because the subjugation of Black men was so overt that you could lose your life for literally looking at a white person the wrong way. And so we see that during the Civil Rights Movement, wherein there was this great effort to overthrow societal mores and discrimination, that there was gender discrimination from Black men towards Black women. And so even Michael Eric Dyson wrote a wonderful book on sexism in the Civil Rights Movement, and he says without hesitation that King was a sexist. He expected Black women to play an inferior role, that the men would be out front and the women would do the labor behind the scenes, cook and make pamphlets and things along this line. But you see that there would have been no Civil Rights Movement. Rosa Parks, in the role that she played in. And the thing that's fascinating about Rosa Parks is that this was actually her second entree into the Civil Rights Movement when in Birmingham, she refused to get off the bus. She was very engaged in the issue of the rape of Black women. And she would go down and do interviews and trying to bring that to national attention. And so even today, and you see the role that Black women are playing, some of the strongest voices that you see for liberation in this country are the voices of Black women.
One question that came to mind for me as you were speaking was about if the current protest movements are being led mostly at this point by young people, what do you think that Black churches can do to get young people more invested and involved in the church if that's where young people are focused on right now is in the protest movements?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that question because that's one of my talking points. 50% of my job in normal times is to go around the country talking to congregations and presbyterians and synods. And it's fascinating to me because this actually transcends race. When I talk to congregations, Black, white, Latino, I ask them, what if you had a prayer list and you could get your top 3 priorities, what would you want? And either number 1 or number 2 are more young people in the life of the church. Every church wants it, especially we're in a graying church in this country. I mean, when you look at the rolls, we're talking about 60, 70, 80-year-old people in the church, and fewer young people are going to church, and they're adopting the title of nuns, as Pew Research has entitled them. And so what's the one thing that churches are most intimidated by? The social justice. They really are very concerned about being deemed political. They don't want to have that charge of we're bringing politics into the church. Now, I do think there's a racial divide there because I think that's more of an issue with white churches, where Black churches have a long history of political engagement, especially with voting rights and Jim Crow discrimination, things along that line. So it's not as much as a push when you're talking to a Black congregation or a congregation of color, but white churches are real hesitant, by and large, of talking about social justice issues. But what's the one thing that young people are mostly engaged in? Social justice issues. So the one thing that we're most intimidated by in the life of the church is the one thing that would draw in young people. So what churches have to do is, one, they have to find out what movements are going on locally in their community. And they have to communicate with young people that we are a resource for you, we are an ally for you, we are a partner for you. If you're having a march, we'll open up the doors of the church to you. If you want to stop by, you want to have a meeting, you want to use the bathroom, just want to have a safe place to come in. And so we've got to stop inviting people to the church to participate in our activities and find out what their activities are and support them in those endeavors. And so I think there's a real missed opportunity, because in every community, there's a church somewhere, every community. And when in communities are starting to be very engaged with community activism. And so we've got to find ways to inform young people that we are a resource for them and to support them. And to let them know that the church is concerned about more than just the church. That's the charge, is that all you care about is the church. You don't really care about justice issues, don't care about what's going on in the community. You're homophobic, you're gender biased. And so to let them know that the church really is at a different place now, because I'm excited by the church. As I mentioned earlier, I go across the country talking to congregations. A commitment to social justice is growing, in particular in the life of the Presbyterian Church, and in particular to racial justice. There's more conversation in the life of the Presbyterian Church right now about racial justice than I think in the history of this denomination. And not only with leadership, because our leadership has always been more progressive than the members. You know, the prototype for a Presbyterian used to be a white, single female Republican, you know, but now, and so the prototype for a clergy was always a male Democrat. And so now where more of our members are starting to be more progressive, but especially regardless of their political affiliation, they're starting to see that this talk about racial discrimination, this talk about racial injustice that's continuing into the day, is not just something that the liberals are crying foul about, but it's something that's actually occurring.
Okay, so one other question that I had for you was about how the PCUSA can share the history of Black protests and what we can do to ensure we're documenting and recording kind of current protests for racial justice for future generations. You know, that's something that we're focused on here at the Presbyterian Historical Society. We're always looking for ways that we can make sure that we are engaged with what is current, you know, the current protests for racial justice.
I think right now to look at our own communities, because we're at an interesting period in the history of this country when you look at the men and women who are still alive, who have seen the transition from a Jim Crow society to life today. And for example, I went to my first 5 years in school were in a segregated school. And so we need to gather those voices and record those voices and give audience to those voices within our congregation, to talk about life in our cities, what it was like growing up, because it really is hard to believe the fact that the country has changed so much so quickly. I mean, when I left high school I left in 1977, fall of 1977, I entered college at North Carolina Central University in Durham, North Carolina. The movie theater was still segregated, and Blacks were still sitting in the balcony and whites were still sitting down. So that was the jure segregation, where obviously the laws had changed, but it had never changed. And so I still remember within the course of that year, someone told me, well, you know, the movie theater is no longer segregated. And I went home that weekend just to sit downstairs, because that was the first time in my life had I ever sat downstairs in that movie theater. So we've got to talk about this. And that leads me to the whole controversy over critical race theory, which is a made up controversy. It's a talking point for individuals to get people riled up. But we've got to talk wholeheartedly about the history of this country, the good, the bad, and the ugly, to tell that story, because one of the issues I think with American society is that we don't know our own story. We don't know anyone else's story, but we don't really know our own story. And we don't know what our communities were like just 30, 40 years ago. You know, some towns were sundown towns, where a Black person had to literally be out of town before the sun set, or you put your life in jeopardy. And for many of these towns, you couldn't even set foot in these towns because it would place your life in danger. Those stories need to be told. And I think the opponents of so-called critical race theory, just incorporating race as a talking point in the history of this country, are making a mistake, because young people can handle these stories. I mean, it's intriguing to see, and it helps them to see how much times have changed. But again, we as Americans, we know our own life story, and we don't have the value that we once used to have on education. We don't value education. We don't value public education. And I'm from the state of North Carolina originally, and North Carolina was a leader in especially higher education. And now I was listening to a state legislator from North Carolina just the other day, and she said that out of 50 states, North Carolina is right now near the bottom rankings for higher education. And that was a pride and joy for the state. And it's because of the horrible leadership from our legislators. I mean, we have legislators who are picking out talking points, trying to rile people up, trying to get votes, and they're willing to do anything, including misrepresent critical race theory. What it really means is basically telling the story, an inclusive story. And that's also was a motivation for the book. I wanted to tell the story, the Black story, in a way, one that people could read and understand and accept and generate conversations about it. Because again, race is such a sensitive issue in this country. The minute you start talking about race, people start getting paranoid, you know, and you're just trying to shame me. You want to call me a racist, or you want to say I'm an Uncle Tom, or all of these stereotypes that we have of one another. But we've got to learn how to engage one another in a way wherein we don't take personally a discussion about facts. You know, a fact is a fact is a fact, but we're at a dangerous time in the life of this country where the value that we have, or lack of value that we have for education, is going to do serious damage to our nation. And it really is going to cause us to implode as a nation, where we're going to turn on one another and have all of these divisions. But the point of an education is not to relay facts, but to teach a child how to think, how to consider different options, how to look at different perspectives, and to grow from that. And so I think we're at a point where we're devaluing the benefits of an education.
Well, you know, I did have as one of my questions, what do you think is at stake in these debates about American history? But I mean, you hit the nail on the head. That is exactly what is at stake in these kind of debates right now. So one other thing I was going to ask about was just about the role that the Presbyterian Church played. Yeah, I mean, you've touched on this, but I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate further about the role the Presbyterian Church played in kind of Freedom Summer and kind of the efforts to register Black voters in that specific moment in Presbyterian history or in American history.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, with the leadership of Blake and Coffin, the national church began to wrestle with the issue of race. And the church, but I think the real contribution was with individual Presbyterians who were engaged in Freedom Summer, individual Presbyterians who were actually engaged in the civil rights movement as a whole. And it's fascinating to listen to local historians talk about the role that clergy played, and then if there's a Presbyterian church there, chances are that Presbyterian clergy were engaged in the civil rights movement. So many stories, and I think you can parse it racially. African-American Presbyterian clergy were very engaged in their local community and then in the wider community. And to look at ways in which Presbyterians, one of the things I love about this church is that we are committed to study. You know, if you book clubs, you know, we have more committees as a part of our structure. You can't do anything without first studying it. And I think that exposure offered Presbyterians an openness to evolving, to having a hunger for new ideas that are coming. And so when the civil rights movement burst on the scene, and it really did burst on the scene because, again, there's always been Black protests throughout the history of this country, but the civil rights movement put it out front. I mean, and oftentimes historians will talk about the benefit that the television camera was to the civil rights movement. It was televised. You know, something could happen and you could see it either right then or you could see it that afternoon in the evening news. And that really exposed America to the rawness of racism, and just how violent it was and how ugly it was. But I also think it inspired young people to say, I'm going to go down and be a part of Freedom Summer to provide voter registration. And as a matter of fact, out of Freedom Summer came schools that were established for the education of Black children. And now it was a hodgepodge of individuals who responded, but Presbyterians definitely were amongst that number.
Okay, well, I am going to switch to some of our questions from our audience because it looks like we've got some questions coming in.
Okay.
So the question that we have, did researching and writing this book directly change or influence the way you approach your daily work as a leader in the PCUSA? If yes, how?
Well, I would say it gave me some more ammunition for the work that I do at PCUSA. I've always seen justice issues as integral to the life of the church. When I was a pastor, as you mentioned, I started out in Virginia, almost 5 years, had 3 congregations there. As a matter of fact, Reverend William Barber, who's over the Poor People's Campaign with Presbyterian clergy, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, Reverend Barber was in that same community that I was in. And we found out that there was a hazardous waste layover place in the Black community that the Black community did not know about, that the city had given permission for hazardous waste to be brought into the Black community and didn't tell anyone. So he led a protest movement there. This was back, I left there in beginning of 96. So this was back in 95, 94. And for a couple of years before he left and then I left, we were leading protests similar to the Poor People's Campaign in the small town of 16,500 people, Martinsville, Virginia. Social justice has always been, to me, a part of my faith and a part of the Christian faith. I really struggle with Christians who can't see that, because I don't see how you can't see that. As Christians, we believe, and especially as Reformed Christians, that God is a God of justice. And we clearly get that indication from Scripture. Again, looking at the book of Exodus, I mean, justice is just the whole purpose for the book of Exodus. I've heard the cry of my people in Egypt, and God sets them free, sends to them a deliverer, Moses, Miriam, and Aaron. And then when you get to the last third of the Old Testament, the prophets, you can't talk about the prophets and not talk about justice. And not only a powerful part of that for me is that the prophets not only on behalf of God demanded justice on the part of individuals, but justice is demanded of nations as well. And the prophets came to condemn the nations for their injustice, and especially Israel and Judah, saying that you're not fulfilling your role. You're not special. I didn't choose you because you were a special people. I chose you to make you a special people, to be an example of what it meant to live as the people of God. And so we see that throughout the Bible, and then you get to Jesus, and you can't talk about Jesus and not talk about justice. Jesus in Matthew 23, one of my favorite passages, was asked, he said that he criticized the religious leaders and said, you're doing the little things that are important, like attending the synagogue, going to church, paying your tithes. And today we think those are the big things, but those were the little things. He said, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the law. And the first thing he listed was justice. And so you cannot read Scripture without finding that we are created in the image of a God of justice. And so it's always been a part of my makeup. I mean, even in seminary, I would participate in Meals on Wheels and other movements. And while it's not a justice movement, it's really, feeding people. But I saw it as being a vital part of being a Christian and a pastor, that we've got to have eyes on our community. We've got to have eyes on the world. And if there's injustice in the world, then I am at ill ease. I cannot be at peace as long as there are people out there who are being discriminated against, people who don't have health care, people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, and they all are under 20 hours, so they don't have any type of benefits. They don't get paid a living wage. That there are not only the individual pains that people experience, but also the systemic crimes that are committed against people. When there are laws that oppress people, that take away people's voting rights, when there are laws that discriminate against the LGBTQ community, when there are laws that say that discrimination is okay, the church, that's part of the purpose of the church. The church is not an institution that's focused on itself. The church is an institution that reminds us that we all are children of God and that we are citizens of two kingdoms. We're citizens of the state, but we also are citizens of the kingdom of God. And they are not equal allegiances. That when one comes in conflict with the other, our primary allegiance is to God and to God's word and to God's kingdom. And so any laws that human beings make are to be governed by the word of God. And if they fall in conflict with the word of God, then we stand firm for the word of God. And so it's always been a part of who I am. And as an African-American who grew up in the Christian church, again, I made reference to the fact that liberation preaching has always been a part of the life of the Black church. And again, the things that would cause me to get in trouble in some pulpits would not be a problem in the Black church. You encourage people to go out and vote, and not telling people who to vote for. So it's important to vote. And because the right to vote has always been almost a spiritual endeavor for Black people, because they knew that if they could gain the right to vote, then other rights and privileges would soon follow. And so again, but it has been, I will say, writing this book and the research, it has been very fulfilling to me. It has been inspiring to me to think of, as I was exposed to so many of the stories that are not being told about the contributions of African Americans to the history of this country, and therein, because America has a global footprint, the impact on this world. Just thinking about so many individuals, Maggie Walker, who was from Richmond, started the first bank in this country by a woman, period. And she was a philanthropist. She was very engaged in her community. Now, in fact, Madam, much like the model of Madam C.J. Walker, she would train Black women for non-domestic roles. Saying you can be a professional, you can be you learn certain skills that put you in for white collar jobs. And so not Henry Highland Garner, but Morgan Garrett, who was an inventor, who invented the gas mask, the traffic sign. The French argued with the Black community, said, well, Black people didn't invent ice cream. The French invented ice cream, but African Americans said, we really played a role with ice cream and potato chips. Just so many different contributions that are surprising to see the Black aviators who learned how to fly Bessie Coleman. And so to see how Black people have really worked and were successful to overcome discrimination, and the number of Black towns that were in this country. I mean, throughout this country, that were really, they were producing wealth. They had banks, churches, schools. And so Black success has been a pivotal part. And again, we know about Rosewood and about Tulsa, which was oftentimes the result of Black affluence, that racism would rear its ugly head and would really violence was the result. But it has kind of almost made me more committed to the issue of social justice, and say that, this is not something that's new. It's not something that's individual with me, but it's really been a gift from God to have a spirit that's strong and vibrant and really unbroken. And we make no apologies for who we are.
Well, you touched on this a little bit, but one question that came up from the audience was, what was something that surprised you? What surprised you the most as you did the research for this book? Did you learn something new that was completely unexpected?
Specifically, yes. I mean, so many things were surprising. Again, to see the level of Black success, even during colonial days. And I will say this, I think this is probably something that, and this is a statement that a friend of mine who's reading the book now said impacted him. Lerone Bennett Jr., African-American historian, in his book, Before the Mayflower, no, it's Confrontation, Black and White. Quarles wrote before the Mayflower Relief. And he talks about how the first Africans who were brought here during the 1619 period that we know so much about now came as indentured servants. And that the racial attitude in the country where they were treated the same as white indentured servants. And so between 1619 and I would say around 1640-ish, there was some equality. As a matter of fact, indentured servants were all on the same level and they related very well to one another. And you could eventually, you got your freedom. Anthony Johnson became a landowner. As a matter of fact, one of the first slaveholders in the country because of a lawsuit, he condemned another African to perpetual slavery. As a matter of fact, it's the first recorded lawsuit in the country that a black man was sued by a black man for his freedom, and the enslaved man lost and became a slave. And so what is interesting is that white supremacy has not always been an element in the history of this country, that it really developed out of the economic profit of slavery. That slavery was so profitable that justification had to be found. Therefore, blacks had to be deemed inferior. Blacks had to be deemed a different creature almost. White superiority had to justify it, and especially for Christians, because an early part of the conversation was, how can you be a Christian and hold another person in enslavement? Doesn't that go against Christian principles, Christian values? And so we had this racist theology that developed that said, because of Genesis 9 and 10, where Noah cursed his son Ham, who is the progenitor of the African nations, therefore it is okay for whites to hold blacks in enslavement. And so you had the growth of white supremacy in this country didn't start out with the foundation of this country. That it actually materialized once the huge amounts of revenue were being produced by slavery. Therefore, justification for slavery had to be found. And so for roughly almost 40 years, blacks and whites who were brought here were able, now of course it's a small percentage of the country, up in days time, but they were that again, the white supremacy was not endemic to the life of the nation. So that's, I think, a point that we need to understand, that there is an economic justification for white supremacy. It's privilege, there's benefit from it, and it's not just so that people can feel better about themselves, but they are receiving a wide array of benefits from white supremacy. And again, we talk a lot about white privilege and how just being white, having white skin, allows you to have privileges that people with brown and black skin do not have. And I mean, we all see it. You hear the stories. We don't talk about it as much. You go into a mall or a store and you're followed by the store detective, or you're treated differently, things along that line. I remember the story told about Oprah. Oprah was in a shop, I think it was in France, and the handbags averaged about $30,000. And the lady didn't recognize Oprah and said, well, can you afford anything in this store? Simply because she was a black woman. And so there are a lot of pieces that really were eye-opening for me. Again, I think just the wide amount of information is out there about the Black experience that's really not being told. We in this country, we like a good story, but we retell the same stories over and over again. I like the History Channel, but there's a lot of repeat of the characters. There are so many characters in American history that were people of color, there were women that are not being told, that are fascinating and that speak to people today. And I also think the fact that faith has been an intimate part of protest in the history of this country. Again, the Civil Rights Movement was a faith-based protest movement, centered in the church. The foot soldiers were people of faith, and again, a wide array of faiths: the Jewish faith, Presbyterians, United Methodists, Baptists, Pentecostals, all came together for this point. And even the abolitionist movement. The Quakers were primarily the denomination that were more out in the forefront against slavery, but many of the people who were engaged in the abolitionist movement were people of faith. So the role that faith plays in political activism, in social justice activism, and in justice advocacy is of vital importance. And I think that's something that the church has to rediscover And I think it is, again, discovering it. I think that people are raising some serious questions about what's the connection between faith and activism, and what role does the church play, and what role should I, as an individual person of faith, play?
Well, it looks like we have one more question. We have time for one more. This one reads, how has the history of Black protests in the United States influenced global protests, or how have similar stories played out globally?
Oh, it's just no question. It's just no question. Again, especially with the arrival of global media. Obviously the first one was the television. We had radio before then, but I don't think radio played the same role that television did. And when you look at the fact that the civil rights movement, we could say that the civil rights movement influenced the African independence movement during the colonial period, but also the African colonial movement also inspired the civil rights movement. So I think it went hand in hand. But many African leaders who led independent movements in their country would make mention of the civil rights movement and say, if American Blacks can rise up and throw off their oppressors, then we can do the same. Global social media today, obviously, there's just no question that what's happening in this country has influenced globally. You look at the protests against the murder of George Floyd. There were protests across the world, protesting the murder of George Floyd. When you would see in France, Paris, France, and London, England, in Nigeria, Black Lives Matter signs. And so I think it definitely resonates across the world. And I do think that American contribution to liberation movements, it does need to be studied, because people do mirror what happens in this country. And again, because of the fact that we have the ability to have instant communication around the world, what happens in America resonates everywhere else. And so I do think that, again, people look at what's going on in America. I think there's a greater sensitivity in the world today over the rights of gays and lesbians because of the movement in this country. And obviously the rights of BIPOC men and women. If it's happening in America, it will have an impact elsewhere.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm going to end there. For all of our viewers, make sure to check out Reverend Hawkins' book, Unbroken and Unbowed, A History of Black Protests in America, which is on sale now, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to pass it to Kristen. She's going to close out. Oh, and there's an image of the book right there.
Well, thank you, Jimmie, for joining us today. And thank you, Sonia, for leading this great conversation. PHS Live is our monthly webinar series, and it's made possible through donations from all the folks out there who are tuning in and viewing and supporting us. So we appreciate everyone who's watching today and who will watch on Facebook and in the future. So we're going to continue PHS Live next month with a session on the photographs of the religious news service, we're going to share a little bit about our efforts to digitize the photographs of the religious news service, which is a great kind of ecumenical collection here housed at PHS that document religious history in the United States and across the globe. So we hope you can tune into that on March 10th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And until then, again, thank you so much, Reverend Hawkins, and we look forward to sharing more about your book in the future and hopefully welcoming you back again. So everyone, take care.
Thanks for having me.